Some of history's most famous stories are actually ancient political spin. A tale told by a king to secure his throne can, over centuries, become a beloved legend that entire nations accept as fact. We will uncover the hidden machinery that transforms deliberate propaganda into timeless myth, revealing why we so easily believe the stories we are told. By the end of this journey, you will possess a new lens for viewing history, one that separates compelling narrative from verifiable truth. How did a rival civilization's smear campaign become a permanent stain in our history books? What alchemy turns a ruler's blatant self-promotion into a nation's founding epic? The most powerful myths are not born from truth, but from our deep desire to believe them. What foundational story from your own culture might you start to question? Propaganda and myth are two sides of the same coin, yet we often view them through entirely different lenses. At its heart, ancient propaganda was a tool for power. It was information carefully shaped and spread by rulers and states, designed to influence public opinion and secure loyalty. Think of it not as a simple lie, but as a narrative crafted with a specific goal in mind: to legitimize a leader, to unite a people against a common enemy, or to justify a controversial decision. A myth, however, feels different. It is a story that has seeped into the soul of a culture, often told and retold until it feels like an intrinsic part of that society's identity. These stories explain the world's origins, celebrate heroic ideals, and provide a shared moral compass. They are rarely questioned because they feel fundamentally true. The fascinating transformation, the real alchemy, happens when a piece of deliberate political messaging loses its original, manipulative context. Over generations, the sharp edges of its purpose are worn smooth. The story is no longer seen as a king's boast or a rival's slander. It is simply accepted as our story, a timeless legend about who we are and where we came from. This distinction is our foundation. With it, we can begin to identify the specific conditions, the cultural petri dish, that allows a calculated narrative to mutate into a beloved truth. That urgent need for control gives birth to a powerful story, one designed to be heard and remembered. In an age before mass media, how did a ruler ensure their carefully crafted narrative reached every corner of their kingdom? The answer lies in the most dominant and visible mediums of the ancient world. Monuments of stone and precious metal were the billboards of antiquity. A towering obelisk covered in hieroglyphs was not merely decorative, it was a permanent declaration of a pharaoh's divine right and military might, a story carved in stone for all to see, meant to inspire awe and obedience for generations. Similarly, coins passed from hand to hand across vast empires carried a ruler's portrait and titles, making every transaction a tiny, silent reinforcement of their authority. But stone and metal were only part of the strategy. The most effective tool for spreading a narrative was the human voice. Epic poems and songs, performed by bards in royal courts and public squares, transformed a king's political agenda into a thrilling saga of heroism and destiny. These stories were set to rhythm and rhyme not just for artistry, but for memorability, allowing a complex message to be carried, intact, across great distances by people who could not read or write. The narrative was no longer a dry decree, it was entertainment, it was culture, it was the very soundtrack of a society. This combination of monumental permanence and oral repetition created an echo chamber, surrounding the common person with a single, powerful version of reality. The message was simple, emotionally charged, and inescapable. But how does this deliberate political message escape its time and become something far grander, a myth that feels eternal? The journey requires a second, equally powerful ingredient. The human voice, echoing through a crowded square, carried a unique kind of authority. A royal crier did not merely announce news, he performed it, his tone and demeanor shaping how the message was received. This was a world without competing headlines, where the only version of a battle's outcome was the one declared by the state. But sound is fleeting. To make a story permanent, rulers turned to stone. The intricate reliefs carved into temple walls were not just art, they were the official record, a visual narrative designed to be undeniable. You would see a pharaoh depicted as a giant, towering over his puny enemies, a god on earth receiving blessings from the pantheon. There was no room for alternative interpretations, no space for the perspective of the defeated. This was history written by the victors, literally set in stone for all future generations to witness. Even everyday commerce reinforced the message. A coin passed from your hand to a merchant's was a tiny, pocket-sized propaganda piece. It bore the emperor's profile, his name, and often a symbolic word like peace or victory. Every transaction became a silent, subconscious reminder of who held power and the supposed blessings that power brought. These channels, the crier, the temple wall, the coin, formed an integrated media ecosystem. They repeated the same core narratives through sight, sound, and touch, creating a coherent and inescapable reality for the citizen. The stories they told were simple, emotionally resonant, and almost always designed to trigger a specific feeling, whether it was pride in the empire, fear of its enemies, or gratitude towards its leader. This ancient understanding of psychology is what made the messaging so potent and so difficult to question. But for a story to truly escape its political origins and become a lasting myth, it needs to survive the death of its original author. It must outlive the empire that birthed it, finding new life in the hands of those who tell the tale for entirely different reasons. The brilliance of this strategy was its psychological efficiency. A ruler did not need to convince his people to believe something entirely new. He simply had to attach his own ambitions to what they already held sacred. In ancient Egypt, the pharaoh was not merely a king. He was the living embodiment of the god Horus, a divine intermediary whose rule was as natural and necessary as the rising sun. To question his authority was to disrupt the cosmic order itself, a sin against the gods that guaranteed chaos. This was not just political spin, it was a theological lock on power. We see the same pattern in the Roman Empire, where emperors, starting with Augustus, were deified after their deaths. Their achievements were portrayed as the direct favor of Jupiter and the pantheon, making the success of Rome and the will of its leader one, and the same with divine providence. A military conquest was not an act of territorial greed. It was the spreading of civilization ordained by the gods. This fusion of state and faith made the political narrative emotionally unassailable. How could a common farmer who prayed to these same gods for a good harvest possibly argue against a victory that was declared a sacred event? The propaganda became woven into the very fabric of daily worship and cultural identity. It was in the temples they visited, the festivals they celebrated, and the stories they told their children. The message ceased to be a message at all. It became a fundamental truth, a part of the world as they knew it. This deep cultural embedding is the crucial ingredient that allows a political story to survive its creator. When the empire that crafted it finally crumbles into dust, the narrative, now detached from its original source, does not die with it. It simply waits for a new storyteller to find it. The death of an empire does not mean the death of its stories. In fact, the end of political control is often when a narrative truly breaks free, finding refuge in the most resilient of all archives, human memory. As the stone monuments crack and the official records turn to dust, the story is picked up by the voices of storytellers, grandparents, and wandering bards. They become the new guardians of the tale, but they are not neutral archivists. With each retelling around a campfire or in a village square, the story is subtly reshaped. The precise year of a battle, the complex political motives of a king, these specific details are the first to fade. They are the brittle shell of the story, and they crumble away. What remains, however, is the sturdy core, the powerful emotional arc. The hero's journey, the great battle between good and evil, the triumph against impossible odds. These universal themes are what the human mind is built to remember and retell. The story is smoothed like a stone tumbled in a river for centuries. The sharp, jagged edges of its original political purpose, the specific slander against a rival, the blatant self-aggrandizement of a ruler, are gradually worn away. What emerges is a simpler, more polished, and far more palatable version of events. This process of simplification is not a corruption of the story, but the first essential alchemy in its transformation from recorded history into living legend. It sheds its time-bound skin to become something timeless, and once a story has achieved this simpler, more powerful form, it is ready to travel, carried on the currents of trade, migration, and conquest, where it will encounter new lands and be given entirely new meaning. These wandering tales, now stripped of their original context, were perfect vessels for new meaning. As merchants traveled the Silk Road and soldiers marched with conquering armies, they carried these stories in their minds like cultural seeds. A legend born in the political courts of Mesopotamia could find itself taking root in the hills of Greece, but it would not arrive unchanged. To survive in a new land, the story had to adapt. The foreign god at the center of the tale might be replaced by a local deity with similar powers. A strange, unpronounceable hero's name would be swapped for that of a familiar champion from the new culture's own folklore. This was not plagiarism, it was a process of cultural translation, making the exotic narrative feel instantly relatable and true to its new audience. Imagine a story about a great flood, originally used by a king to demonstrate his divine mandate to rule. As it travels, it gets grafted onto local creation myths. The specific king is forgotten, but the theme of divine punishment and renewal remains, now serving to explain the whims of a different set of gods. The original piece of propaganda, its political teeth pulled, becomes a spiritual lesson. This cross-pollination creates a hybrid story, a narrative chimera that feels authentically local to multiple, distant peoples. They all share the core of the tale, yet each believes it is uniquely theirs. The original intent, the calculated move by a forgotten ruler to secure his power, becomes buried under these layers of cultural adaptation, like a message written on a parchment that has been scraped clean and written over again and again. By the time these blended stories reach the scholars and historians of a later age, their disparate origins were utterly invisible. Once a story was written down, its transformation was complete. The fluid, ever-changing oral tale was captured, pinned to the page like a butterfly in a display case. This act of writing was often sponsored by kings, emperors, or wealthy patrons who commissioned scribes and poets to create an official history. These authors were not mere recorders, they were editors, making critical choices about which stories to include and, just as importantly, which to leave out. A messy, complicated battle might become a clean, heroic victory. A rival's legitimate claim to the throne could be reduced to a footnote or erased entirely. The narrative was carefully framed to reflect the values and justify the power of the patron who paid for the ink and parchment. This written version then gained an immense authority that the spoken word could never achieve. A story told by 100 different voices has 100 variations, but a story written in a single, beautiful book appears to be the one and only truth. It was durable, it could be copied and distributed, and it carried the weight of the written word, a technology that seemed magical and absolute to most people. This authorized chronicle became the primary source, the definitive account. Future historians, writing centuries later, would discover this single, frozen version of events and accept it as fact, not realizing they were reading a masterpiece of editorial selection, a story shaped by the political and financial interests of a bygone era. The legend, now codified and stamped with the seal of scholarly approval, was ready for its most enduring role, to become the foundation upon which nations would build their identity. A single discovery can seem to turn legend into undeniable fact. When the determined amateur archaeologist Heinrich Schliemann dug into a mound in modern-day Turkey, he uncovered the burnt remains of an ancient city. He immediately declared it was Troy, the very city of Homer's epic poem. The public and many scholars were electrified. Here was physical proof, a city that had been destroyed by fire and war, seemingly confirming the historical truth of the Iliad and its legendary 10-year siege. This moment creates what we might call the archaeological illusion. A tangible discovery, a piece of broken pottery, a layer of ash, a grand tomb, appears to perfectly match a story we have known for centuries. The human mind is a pattern-seeking machine, and it desperately wants to connect the dots, so when we find evidence that fits a beloved narrative, we are quick to label it as the final proof. That destroyed city layer could have been the result of any number of forgotten conflicts, a raid by a neighboring kingdom, an internal revolt, or a simple, devastating fire. But because its story of destruction aligns so neatly with the legend of a great war, we pin the famous name to it. We fit the evidence to the story we already want to believe. This process gives the myth a powerful new foundation, no longer just a tale passed down through generations, but a reality confirmed by stone and soil. It feels less like a story and more like documented history. Yet this apparent confirmation often masks a far more complex and ambiguous reality. The physical evidence rarely tells a simple story, but we are so eager for confirmation that we often hear only the version we wish was true. This romantic reshaping gave ancient stories a new kind of beauty, one that obscured their original purpose entirely. The romantics of the 18th and 19th centuries were not cold historians. They were artists and poets reacting against the smoke and machinery of their own age. They saw in the ancient past a world they felt they had lost, a world of raw emotion, noble savages, and unspoiled nature. When they looked at a figure like King Arthur, they did not see a probable warlord from the Dark Ages, a political leader fighting for territory and influence. They saw a chivalric hero, a pure-hearted king surrounded by virtuous knights, his story a parable about honor and the quest for a sacred ideal. The gritty, political reality of maintaining power in a fractured Britain was scrubbed away, replaced by the gleaming, moral clarity of a fairy tale. This was not an act of forgery, but of profound reinterpretation. The past became a mirror for their own ideals, and they polished that mirror until it showed them exactly what they wanted to see. A story that began as a piece of dynastic propaganda, meant to legitimize a ruling family by linking it to a legendary past, was now a beautiful, universal story about good versus evil. This aesthetic makeover was incredibly effective. It made these ancient tales feel profoundly relevant and emotionally resonant to a modern audience, who in turn passed these purified versions on to their children. The legend was now not only stripped of its original context, but it had been actively redressed in the most appealing clothing. It was ready for its final and most powerful incarnation, to become not just a story, but a product for mass consumption. The printed page gave these stories wings, but film gave them a soul. A story that once took hours to recite around a fire could now be experienced in a single, breathtaking spectacle by millions of people at once. The flickering images of a Hollywood epic did more than just tell the tale of a Trojan war or an Egyptian queen. They made you feel as if you were there, standing in the shadow of the wooden horse or sailing down the Nile. This was a revolution in storytelling, and it came with its own set of rules. To capture such a vast audience, the story had to be simplified. The messy political motivations of a historical figure, the complex web of alliances that led to a war, the morally gray decisions that defined real leadership, these were the first elements cut from the script. They were replaced by a crystal-clear, emotionally driven narrative of good versus evil. The hero became more noble, the villain more purely wicked, and the stakes more universally understandable. A comic book, a radio drama, a best-selling novel, all followed the same formula, sanding down the rough, ambiguous edges of history to create a perfectly polished gem of a story, one that was easy to market and even easier to consume. The modern version of King Arthur was no longer a possibly real, flawed warlord. He was the once and future king, a symbol of hope. The original piece of propaganda, crafted to unite a kingdom, was now a global brand, its logo a shining castle in a land of myth. This mass dissemination creates a powerful feedback loop. The most popular film version of a legend becomes, for most people, the definitive version. It eclipses the older, more complicated texts and erases the subtle fingerprints of its ancient propagandists. We are left with a beautiful, powerful, and ultimately hollow shell. So why do we, armed with all the tools of modern scholarship, so eagerly accept this simplified product? Perhaps it is because we are not so different from the ancient crowds listening to the royal crier. We are drawn to a compelling story, especially one that offers moral clarity in an increasingly complex world. We crave heroes to admire and villains to despise, and the entertainment industry is more than happy to provide them, even if they never truly existed. Our minds are not blank slates waiting for facts. They are active engines built to seek out stories. Cognitive science shows us that human brains are wired for narrative, not for spreadsheets. We use stories as a fundamental tool to process the overwhelming complexity of the world around us, to find patterns in the chaos, and to create a sense of order and meaning. This is precisely why ancient propaganda was so devastatingly effective, and why the myths it spawned feel so deeply true. They did not invent new, alien patterns. They simply plugged into the oldest, most comfortable story archetypes our minds already recognize. The hero's journey, where a figure rises from obscurity to achieve a great destiny. The founding myth, where a people are chosen for a special purpose. The epic battle against a monstrous force of chaos. These are the templates of our collective imagination. When a ruler's political agenda is framed as a heroic quest, or a military conquest is presented as a sacred battle against evil, it bypasses our critical faculties and speaks directly to our subconscious. These patterns are not just entertaining, they are cognitive shortcuts. A story that fits a familiar archetype is easier to remember, easier to retell, and crucially, easier to accept without question. Our brains, in their relentless quest for meaning, will often choose a good story over a messy set of facts every single time. A clean, emotionally satisfying narrative simply feels more true than a complicated reality full of ambiguity and contradiction. This inherent bias, this deep-seated craving for a coherent plot, makes us the perfect, willing audience for a well-crafted legend. Recognizing this vulnerability, this built-in preference for a good story, is the essential first step in learning to read history, not for its comforting myths, but for its challenging and far more human truth. The legend of King Arthur perfectly illustrates how a myth is forged in the fires of political need. The historical reality, if it exists at all, is a faint shadow. Scholars suggest a possible Romano-British commander, a lone figure holding back the Saxon tide in the chaotic centuries after Rome's fall. But that minor warlord bears almost no resemblance to the king of legend. The transformation was a deliberate act of creation, authored centuries later by writers like Geoffrey of Monmouth. His History of the Kings of Britain was not a dry historical record. It was a powerful piece of political propaganda commissioned for a new ruling class, the Normans. After their conquest of England, these Norman kings were foreign rulers in a land they did not fully understand. They needed a story, a glorious and ancient past they could claim as their own to legitimize their rule and unite a fractured kingdom. Geoffrey provided it. He conjured a magnificent pre-Saxon history for Britain, a timeline of legendary kings culminating in the magnificent Arthur. This was not mere entertainment, it was nation-building. The glittering Camelot, the noble round table where every knight was equal, the magical sword Excalibur, these were not just charming details. They were the building blocks of an idealized national identity, a shared story of unity, chivalry, and divine right designed to inspire loyalty in every subject from peasant to noble. A nebulous, forgotten warrior was thus reborn as a symbol for an entire people, his legend crafted to serve the very modern project of creating a unified state. This process of weaving a national hero from whole cloth is a story repeated across the globe. The very word Philistine now means an enemy of culture, a person indifferent to art and beauty. This damning stereotype is not an accident of history. It is the direct result of a masterful 3,000-year-old smear campaign. Our primary sources for this civilization come almost exclusively from its rivals, the Egyptians and the Hebrews, who each had powerful political reasons to cast the Philistines as monstrous barbarians. For the Egyptian pharaohs, the Sea Peoples, a confederation of invaders that included the Philistines, represented an existential threat to their empire. The official propaganda carved into temple walls at Medinet Habu does not show a complex military conflict. It depicts a glorious, one-sided slaughter. The Egyptians are portrayed as giants of order, decisively crushing chaotic, faceless hordes who sought to destroy civilization itself. This was not news reporting. It was a message to the Egyptian people, a dramatic justification of the pharaoh's power, and a warning against any who would challenge the state's divine authority. The Hebrew Bible, written from the perspective of a people frequently at war with the Philistines, continues this theme. Here, they are the uncircumcised, the worshippers of false gods like Dagon, the perennial antagonists to heroes like Samson and David. They are the narrative foil, the uncultured other against which a chosen people could define their own identity and divine favor. For centuries, this was the only story we had. But then, the spades of archaeologists began to tell a different tale. Excavations at ancient Philistine cities like Ashkelon and Ekron reveal a people with a remarkably sophisticated and cosmopolitan culture. They lived in well-planned, fortified cities with complex water systems. Their pottery was technically advanced and beautifully decorated. Analysis of cooking pots shows they had a diverse and refined cuisine, with sophisticated methods for fermenting wine and processing olive oil. They were not the cultural bores of legend. They were a settled, urban, and technologically innovative society. The label stuck because it served the storytellers so well. A rival's political necessity became an enduring historical fact, permanently branding an entire civilization with the sins invented by its enemies. This pattern of a leader's boasts becoming unquestioned truth is perhaps nowhere more visible than in the story of a single man who reshaped the world and his own legend with equal force. Augustus understood that power is not just seized, it is scripted. After decades of bloody civil war, he stood as the sole master of Rome, but his position was dangerously new. He needed a story that would not only justify his rule but sanctify it, transforming a military dictator into the benevolent father of a restored republic. His chosen tools were stone and verse. Across the empire, in town squares and temples, citizens would encounter the Res Gesti Divi Augusti, a long inscription that listed his achievements in the first person. It was a masterpiece of selective memory. He detailed the vast sums of money he spent on the people, the gladiatorial games he funded, the roads and aqueducts he built. He presented himself as the restorer of peace, the man who closed the gates of the Temple of Janus, a symbolic act declaring Rome was no longer at war. But the inscription was silent about the terrifying proscription lists that had condemned his political enemies to death and confiscated their wealth, the very funds that likely paid for his public generosity. It erased the brutal power struggles, framing his rise not as a calculated grab for power, but as a reluctant acceptance of authority to save the state. This was not a historical record, it was an autobiography carved in stone, a permanent, unchallengeable version of events. Yet Augustus knew that administrative lists and self-praise on monuments could only do so much. To truly capture the hearts of the people, he needed to tap into their deepest cultural myths, and for that he turned to a poet. Virgil's Aeneid was more than an epic poem, it was a national project. It told the story of Aeneas, a Trojan prince who fled the burning city of Troy, and after many trials founded the Roman people in Italy. The genius of the poem was in its climax, where Aeneas descends into the underworld and is shown a vision of Rome's future heroes, culminating in Augustus himself. With this single, breathtaking literary stroke, Augustus was no longer just a politician. He was the prophesied culmination of a divine plan set in motion 1,000 years earlier. His rule was not an accident of history or the result of an army's loyalty. It was the destiny of Rome fulfilled. By weaving his contemporary rule into the fabric of this foundational epic, Augustus gave his power a poetic and spiritual legitimacy that no legal document could ever provide. He controlled both the official historical narrative through the Res Gesti and the soulful mythic narrative through the Aeneid. The combined effect was overwhelming. The messy, violent reality of the civil wars was replaced in the public imagination by the glorious myth of a golden age, a time of peace, piety, and prosperity brought about by one man. This fabricated ideal became so powerful that it defined what it meant to be a good Roman emperor for the next 300 years. Leaders who followed were measured against the myth of Augustus, a standard he himself had so carefully authored. That label, the Dark Ages, carries a heavy weight of cultural judgment. It suggests a millennium of silence, a long, bleak winter for the human spirit that lasted from the fall of Rome until the brilliant dawn of the Renaissance. But this powerful idea is not a medieval invention, it is a Renaissance one, a masterful piece of self-promotion crafted by the very thinkers who wanted to make their own era shine all the brighter. Men like the poet Petrarch looked back at the 1,000 years that separated them from the glories of ancient Rome and Greece and saw what they considered a vast cultural desert. They framed this entire period as a time of intellectual stagnation, superstition, and artistic decline, a dark middle period separating two great ages of light. This narrative was not an accident. It was a deliberate and politically useful break from the immediate past, a past that was deeply intertwined with the power and intellectual authority of the Church. By casting the medieval period as a time of darkness, Renaissance humanists could position themselves not as continuers of a tradition, but as revolutionary saviors, the ones who were finally relighting the torch of classical reason and beauty. Their era was not just another chapter in history, it was a rebirth, a rinascimento. This brilliant branding exercise required a foil, and the complex, vibrant world of the Middle Ages was flattened into a simple, dark antagonist for their story of enlightenment. The reality, as modern scholarship continually reveals, was starkly different. The so-called Dark Ages were, in fact, a time of profound and quiet innovation. It was during these centuries that the mechanical clock was invented, revolutionizing our relationship with time. It was when the heavy plow transformed European agriculture, allowing for the cultivation of rich, dense soils and leading to population booms. The soaring Gothic cathedrals, with their intricate stonework and breathtaking stained glass, are not monuments to ignorance, but to breathtaking engineering and artistic genius. Universities were born in the medieval period in cities like Bologna and Paris, creating entirely new institutions for learning and debate. The intellectual life was not dormant, it was vibrant, though its focus was often different from the classical ideals so cherished by the Renaissance. The myth of the Dark Ages persists because it is a satisfying story, one of a glorious return to a golden past after a long exile. It is a narrative of progress that makes us feel superior to those who came before. But this case shows us that history is not just written by the victors, it is often rewritten by their descendants, who reshape the past to better suit the needs and flatter the sensibilities of the present. This process of reinvention is not always so grand. Sometimes a myth is born from something as simple as a case of mistaken identity. Those two competing caricatures, the bloodthirsty savage and the noble child of nature, were never about reality. They were weapons in Europe's own internal culture war, projected onto a new continent. For the conquistador, the myth of the savage was a license for plunder. It transformed complex societies with their own laws, religions, and histories into a horde of devil-worshipping cannibals, a threat that had to be subdued for the glory of God and King. This narrative was not an observation, it was a necessary justification. How else could you explain stealing a people's land, their wealth, and their very lives unless you first convinced yourself they were less than human? But then, a counter-myth emerged from the salons of Europe itself. Thinkers like Montaigne, disillusioned with the corruption and endless wars of their own society, crafted the idea of the noble savage. In this fantasy, indigenous people were pure, peaceful, and lived in a state of perfect harmony with nature, uncorrupted by money, power, or organized religion. This was not an act of respect, it was a form of intellectual appropriation. The real, diverse cultures of the Americas were erased just as completely, this time to serve as a blank screen for European self-criticism. They became symbolic props in a philosophical argument they knew nothing about. Whether demonized or romanticized, the actual human beings were rendered invisible, replaced by simplistic symbols that served a foreign agenda. The consequences of this propaganda were not abstract. They echoed through treaties, through laws, and through the barrel of a gun. A colonizer who believed in the savage myth felt justified in using any brutality to subdue a population he saw as inherently violent. A colonizer who believed in the noble savage myth, upon encountering any sign of indigenous warfare, political intrigue, or simple human flaw, would feel a profound sense of betrayal, as if the natives had failed to live up to a European fantasy. This disappointment could then be used to justify the very same policies of displacement and control. Both myths, born an ocean away, became tools that actively dismantled civilizations, proving that the most destructive propaganda is not always a lie about a person, but a story that completely erases them. A nation is not born from treaties and borders alone. It is born from a story. The 19th century was an age of political creation, as new countries like Germany and Italy emerged on the map, and older nations like France and Greece sought to redefine themselves. But these new states faced a profound challenge. How do you turn a collection of diverse regions, each with its own dialects, customs, and local loyalties, into a single, unified people? The answer was not found in the present, but in a carefully curated version of the past. There was a desperate, state-sponsored hunger for founding myths and heroic figures who could symbolize the soul of a nation. The newly unified German Empire, for instance, reached back into the murky depths of its ancient history and plucked a figure from the writings of the Roman historian Tacitus. Arminius, a chieftain of the Cherusci tribe, had led a coalition that annihilated 3 Roman legions in the Teutoburg forest in the year 9. To the Romans, he was a treacherous barbarian. To the German nationalists of the 19th century, he was Hermann the Liberator, the first true German hero, a symbol of a unified people resisting foreign domination. His statue, the Hermannsdenkmal, was erected as a massive monument, depicting him not as a tribal leader in a local skirmish, but as a colossal, national savior holding a sword to the sky. Similarly, in France, the Gaulish chieftain Vercingetorix, who had fought Julius Caesar, was transformed from a defeated adversary into a patriotic icon for a modern France. His statue, commissioned by Emperor Napoleon III, shows him as a noble, tragic hero, his face etched with the sorrow of a man who fought for his homeland. In both cases, the complex realities of these men were scrubbed away. Their tribal affiliations, their personal ambitions, the fact that they were fighting for their own people against an empire, not for a nation that would not exist for another 2,000 years, all of this was erased. They were remade into simple, powerful symbols of an eternal national spirit. This top-down process required more than just statues and stirring speeches. It needed an entire ecosystem to sustain the new mythology. The newly created public school system became the primary vehicle for this national story. Standardized history textbooks presented these simplified legends as undisputed fact, ensuring that every child learned the same foundational narrative. Museums were filled with artifacts arranged to tell a linear story of national progress, culminating in the current state, and annual holidays and commemorations turned these historical events into emotional, shared experiences. The myth was no longer just a story you heard. It was the air you breathed, the lessons you memorized, the songs you sang. It became the invisible backbone of national identity, so deeply embedded that to question the myth felt like a betrayal of the fatherland itself. This institutional machinery did not just preserve history, it actively manufactured a past worthy of the present's political ambitions. A child opens a textbook and sees a hero staring back, a face etched with purpose and virtue. This is where legends cease to be stories and become reality, etched into the soft clay of a young mind. National education systems are perhaps the most potent engines for this final stage of a myth's life cycle. The messy, complex, and often morally ambiguous tapestry of the past cannot be easily woven into a flag. So, the process of simplification begins. Textbooks, approved by state boards and written for mass consumption, perform a quiet surgery on history. They remove the complications, the questionable motives, the perspectives of the vanquished, and the inconvenient facts that do not serve the national narrative. A founding father is presented not as a flawed human being with complex ambitions, but as a marble statue of pure ideals. A war is not a tragic conflict of interests, but a glorious crusade for freedom. These are not lies necessarily, but profound omissions, shaping the past into a clean, linear story of triumph that fosters patriotism and a unified identity. What child would not feel a surge of pride for a country born from such heroism? This creates a powerful, self-perpetuating cycle. One generation learns the simplified legend as fact. They become the teachers, the parents, the politicians of the next. They pass the story on, its truth now unquestioned because it was the very foundation of their own worldview. To challenge the myth in adulthood is not merely to question a historical fact. It feels like a personal betrayal, an attack on one's own identity and the shared memory of a nation. The education system, designed to enlighten, becomes the ultimate guardian of a manufactured past. So what happens when a crack appears in this polished facade? When an archaeologist's trowel uncovers an artifact that does not fit the heroic tale, or when archives are opened to reveal damning documents that had been sealed for generations. The entire foundation of a national identity can suddenly tremble. Sometimes the most powerful response to a new fact is a deeper embrace of the old fiction. This is the backfire effect, a stubborn quirk of the human mind where contradictory evidence does not correct a false belief but instead reinforces it. Imagine telling a lifelong devotee that their cherished national hero was, according to newly uncovered documents, a far more ambiguous and self-serving figure. The reaction is rarely a thoughtful nod and a thanks for the update. More often, it is a surge of defensive emotion. The person does not see a historian presenting data. They see a critic attacking a pillar of their identity. The myth is not just a story they know, it is a story they feel, a story that tells them who they are and where they belong. Challenging it feels like a personal assault. This is the immense obstacle faced by archaeologists and scholars who dedicate their lives to uncovering a more nuanced past. Their discoveries, which should clarify the historical record, are often met with public outrage and accusations of cultural vandalism. The myth, polished by centuries of retelling, simply feels more true than a complex, fragmented, and often less flattering reality. Our allegiance is not to accuracy, but to the emotional comfort of a coherent narrative. How then do we learn to quiet the instinct to defend the story and start listening to the evidence? The story we have always accepted as fact often begins with a single, fragile source. To see through the myth, you must first identify that source and hold it up to the light, asking a series of ruthless questions. Who actually wrote these words and for whom were they performing? An inscription glorifying a pharaoh was not carved by the pharaoh himself, but by a court scribe whose salary and safety depended on flattering his master. A history of a great battle was often commissioned by the victor, written by a poet who lived 100 years after the last spear was thrown. The agenda is not a hidden secret. It is woven into the very fabric of the document. Was the author an eyewitness, or were they compiling rumors and older, now lost texts to suit the political needs of their own time? The when is just as crucial as the who. A chronicle written during a king's reign will tell a very different story from one written under his successor, who may have needed to legitimize his own rule by tarnishing the previous regime. This is not about cynicism, but about context. Every source has a perspective, a bias, a reason for existing beyond mere record-keeping. Think of the magnificent reliefs in an Assyrian palace, depicting the king as a giant, effortlessly crushing his enemies. This is not a news report. It is a press release from a military dictatorship, carved in stone for eternity. The primary source for our understanding of the Carthaginian general Hannibal is not from Carthage, whose libraries were systematically destroyed by Rome. It is from Roman historians like Livy and Polybius, men who, despite their attempts at objectivity, were fundamentally writing about a terrifying national enemy. Their accounts are filtered through the lens of fear, respect, and ultimately, the justification of Rome's brutal final victory. Learning to interrogate a source in this way, to look for the patron, the political climate, and the unstated purpose, is the fundamental skill of historical detection. It allows you to see the faint fingerprints of the original propagandist, left on the story thousands of years ago, guiding your hand toward what was emphasized, what was omitted, and most importantly, why. Once you can read the bias, you can begin the delicate work of separating the political motive from the possible event, the spin from the substance. The most revealing part of a story is often the silence that follows it. When a king's official chronicle meticulously records every triumph but never once mentions a single setback, that void speaks volumes. It tells you that the narrative was not designed to inform, but to project an image of invincibility. These strategic omissions are the subtle fingerprints of the ancient propagandist at work. They guide us to ask not just what the story says, but what it desperately avoids saying. Why does an Egyptian text boast of crushing a rebellion but fail to name the rebel leader? Perhaps because naming him would grant him a legitimacy the state wanted to erase. Why do Roman accounts of a conquered people focus only on their strange rituals and ignore their sophisticated laws or poetry? Because acknowledging their complexity would undermine the justification for their subjugation. These silences are deliberate. They are the negative space in a painting, shaping the subject by what is left out. An archaeological discovery can shatter this curated silence. Imagine finding the ruins of a city described by its enemies as a primitive collection of huts, only to uncover the foundations of a complex water management system and evidence of long-distance trade. The stones themselves cry out, contradicting the written record. The myth of the barbarian collapses not because of a new text, but because of the profound absence of truth in the old one. The story on the page claims they were uncultured, but the evidence in the ground proves they were engineers. This contradiction is a gift to the truth seeker. It is a crack in the myth's polished facade, a place where the dim light of a more complicated reality finally begins to seep through. To become a detective of the past, you must learn to listen for these silences and to stare into these empty spaces, for they often point directly to the political pressures that shaped the entire narrative. So how do we move from spotting these gaps to actively filling them with a more truthful picture? That instinct to defend the story reveals a deep emotional need, but the path to a more truthful history lies in a different direction entirely. Look sideways across the myths of different cultures, and a fascinating pattern begins to emerge. The story of a great, world-ending flood is not the unique property of one sacred text. It is a narrative that echoes from the epic of Gilgamesh in Mesopotamia to the legends of the indigenous peoples of the Americas and Australia. For a long time, this widespread similarity was seen as evidence that a single, global catastrophe had indeed occurred, a divine deluge that scarred the collective memory of all humanity. But the scholarship of comparative mythology offers a more grounded and ultimately more human explanation. These are not fractured memories of one event, but independent stories born from a universal human experience. Nearly every agricultural civilization that sprang up along a river valley, from the Tigris and Euphrates to the Indus and the Yellow River, knew the terrifying power of water. A single season of unusually heavy rains could cause the river to burst its banks, wiping out entire villages, destroying the year's crops, and drowning countless lives in a seemingly arbitrary act of nature. How does a pre-scientific society explain such a devastating, indiscriminate event? They turn it into a story with a moral. The flood becomes a punishment from the gods for human sin, or a necessary cleansing of a corrupt world. The boat, the surviving family, the animals saved in pairs, these are narrative devices that transform a senseless tragedy into a tale of divine justice, renewal, and a second chance for humanity. The core of the story is not the water itself, but the human need to find meaning in catastrophe. When you see the same archetypal plot appearing in cultures separated by vast oceans, you are not looking at shared history, you are witnessing the shared architecture of the human mind. This comparative lens helps to demystify the legend. It reveals the story not as a divine revelation, but as a practical, psychological tool, a way for our ancestors to process trauma and reassert a sense of order in a chaotic world. The power of the story does not come from its historical truth, but from its profound emotional truth. It is a story we tell ourselves to feel that there is a reason behind the suffering and a promise of life after the waters recede. A complex world demands simple stories, and our modern era is no exception. The same psychological machinery that once transformed a king's propaganda into a national legend now fuels the rise of contemporary conspiracy theories. These are not random fantasies, they are the new myths built on the exact same blueprint. They begin with a kernel of undeniable truth or a genuinely confusing event, a political assassination, a rapid technological shift, a global pandemic. These are real, complex, and often frightening occurrences that defy easy understanding. The human mind, craving order above all else, rejects this ambiguity. It seizes upon that confusing kernel and weaves a new story around it, one that replaces chaos with a plot. This plot almost always features a hidden, all-powerful elite, a cabal pulling the strings from the shadows. This is not a new villain, it is the modern incarnation of the ancient dragon or the jealous god, a malevolent force that gives a face to our abstract fears. The story provides what the messy reality cannot: a clear hero, a clear villain, and a satisfying reason for why things went wrong. This emotional payoff is why these theories are so resistant to factual debunking. You cannot logic someone out of a story that they did not logic themselves into. The belief is not rooted in evidence, but in the deep, psychological comfort the narrative provides. It makes a frightening world feel predictable and manageable. The medium has changed from stone carvings and epic poems to internet forums and viral videos, but the mechanism is ancient. We are still telling ourselves stories to explain the shadows on the cave wall, and we are still choosing the story that feels most true over the one that simply is. This reveals a profound continuity in human nature, our timeless need for narrative order, and the enduring vulnerability that makes us so susceptible to a well-told tale, whether it is carved on an obelisk or shared in a social media feed. This responsibility weighs heavily in the quiet of a museum gallery. A curator deciding which arrowhead to place next to a king's scepter is making an ethical choice about what story the artifacts will tell. The same is true for a documentary filmmaker who must choose between a simple, dramatic arc and a more honest, complicated one. Every time we present the past to the public, we face a choice. Do we prioritize the clean, satisfying narrative or the messy, ambiguous truth? The pressure to simplify is immense. A textbook has limited space, a documentary has a running time, and a museum exhibit has a finite budget. It is tempting to smooth over contradictions, to downplay uncertainties in the archaeological record, and to present a single, linear story that is easy for an audience to follow and remember. But this very act of cleaning up the past is how myths are born. When we omit a founding father's ownership of slaves to focus only on his political genius, or when we present an ancient battle as a clear-cut victory instead of a chaotic, bloody stalemate, we are not just simplifying, we are distorting. We are repeating the same process of selective editing that ancient propagandists used to glorify their rulers. The ethical path is more difficult. It requires a commitment to transparency. It means placing a label next to a reconstructed dinosaur skeleton that clearly states which bones were found and which were artistically modeled. It means a historian writing, "We are not certain why this civilization collapsed," and then presenting the three leading theories without insisting one is the definitive truth. It means a filmmaker acknowledging the cultural biases of the primary sources they are relying on, perhaps by giving voice to an academic who can explain that our main account of this war comes from the winning side. This approach resists the commercial temptation to sell a perfect packaged story. It embraces the complexity, the gaps in our knowledge, and the uncomfortable facts that challenge our cherished national identities. It trusts the audience with the reality that history is not a series of answered questions, but an ongoing conversation. And in doing so, it does not make the past less interesting, it makes it profoundly more human. The true story is always found in the cracks and the contradictions, the places where the myth falls apart and real, complicated people begin to emerge. Walk through any grand museum hall and you are walking through an argument. The objects are silent, but their arrangement speaks volumes. A suit of armor placed on a pedestal under a spotlight tells a story of glorious chivalry. That same armor, displayed next to a peasant's humble tunic and a tax collector's ledger, tells a completely different story, one of class disparity and the brutal economics of war. This is the unseen power of curation. Every choice, from the color of the walls to the font on a label, gently guides you toward a specific conclusion about the past. It is a form of storytelling as potent as any epic poem, but it wears the authoritative cloak of scholarship and fact. A monument in a public square operates with even less subtlety. The towering bronze figure of a hero on horseback is not an invitation for debate. It is a daily, physical reinforcement of a myth, demanding reverence and silencing dissent through its sheer, immovable presence. It tells you who is worthy of honor, and by extension, what values your society is supposed to uphold. For generations, these institutions largely acted as the final guardians of the state-sponsored myths we have been exploring. They presented a single, clean, and often triumphant narrative, one that rarely acknowledged its own omissions or the blood often dried on the artifacts in the display cases. But a profound shift is now underway. A new wave of museums is consciously rejecting the role of myth teller and embracing the more difficult, more honest role of truth seeker. This means actively introducing multiple perspectives into the same exhibit. A vase from ancient Greece might be presented not only for its beautiful artistry, but with a label that discusses how it was acquired, perhaps through colonial looting, and how the country of origin is requesting its return. A display on a legendary explorer will now include, alongside the maps of his voyages, the diaries of the indigenous peoples who encountered him, offering a starkly different account of his so-called discovery. This approach does not seek to destroy our heroes, but to complicate them, to restore their humanity by acknowledging their flaws and the full impact of their actions. It transforms a museum visit from a passive act of consumption into an active, critical conversation. You are no longer a student being taught the official story. You are a participant asked to weigh evidence, consider contradictions, and draw your own conclusions. This is the ultimate act of historical resistance, turning the very spaces once used to cement propaganda into forums for its deconstruction. The digital age has not silenced these ancient narratives, it has supercharged them. Our global network acts as a modern-day Silk Road for stories, but the journey is now instantaneous. With a few clicks, anyone can access digitized versions of ancient manuscripts, read scholarly critiques, and watch lectures that deconstruct national legends. This unprecedented access to information should, in theory, be the ultimate myth buster. Yet the very same network also feeds a ravenous appetite for the simple over the complex. A catchy social media post reduces a centuries-old epic to a single, stunning image and a paragraph of text. The nuanced political motives of a pharaoh are stripped away, leaving only a visually striking story of curses and treasure. This simplified version is perfectly engineered for the platforms we use every day, designed to be shared, liked, and remembered in an endless scroll. The algorithm then takes over, noticing your interest in a particular legend and funneling you toward more and more content that confirms that specific narrative. You find yourself in a digital echo chamber where your feed is filled with others who share your fascination, and the myth begins to feel like an undisputed, crowd-sourced truth. The same tool that can host a detailed scholarly blog debunking a myth can also host a viral video that makes that same myth more believable to millions. This is the central paradox of our time. We have all the world's libraries at our fingertips, but we are often drawn to the campfire stories told in the digital town square, stories that travel at the speed of light but have been stripped of their original soul. Navigating this new landscape demands a new kind of literacy, one that goes beyond reading words to reading the very architecture of the internet itself. It requires us to ask not just if a story is compelling, but why it is being shown to us now, and what forces are shaping the version we see. Armed with these insights, you might wonder how to apply them the next time you hear a story that seems too perfect to be true. Here is a simple 5-step checklist you can use to deconstruct any suspect legend. Start with the origin. Who told this story first, and what was their motivation? A chronicle written by a king's court historian has a very different purpose than a merchant's travel diary. Pinpointing the source and its inherent bias is the first crack in the myth's foundation. The second step takes you from the page to the ground. Look for the physical evidence. Does the archaeology support the grand claims of the written record? If a text describes a city of unparalleled wealth, but excavations reveal a small, modest settlement, you have found a critical disconnect. The stones and bones often tell a more honest story than the poets. Third, hold the legend up to a global mirror. Does this story follow a universal pattern, like the hero's journey or the Great Flood narrative? When you find the same plot in cultures separated by oceans and centuries, you are likely looking at a shared human archetype, not a unique historical event. This recognition helps you separate the psychological truth from the factual one. Fourth, interrogate the story's purpose. What political or social need did this narrative fulfill when it was created? Was it meant to unite a fractured kingdom, justify a conquest, or legitimize a new ruling dynasty? Understanding the function of the story in its own time reveals the engine that powered its creation. Finally, and perhaps most crucially, listen for the silence. What is conspicuously missing from the standard telling, whose perspective is erased? A story that only features glorious victories and never acknowledges a single defeat is not a history, it is a commercial for a regime. These 5 questions together form a powerful toolkit, transforming you from a passive receiver of history into an active investigator. This is your first line of defense against the stories that have been crafted to manipulate, a way to reclaim the past from the hands of its most persuasive authors. That foundation of national identity built upon a curated past can become a battleground for the present. These ancient stories are far more than academic curiosities. They are active forces that shape modern politics and ignite contemporary conflict. Competing claims to land, to resources, and to the very right to govern are often rooted in historical narratives that date back centuries or even millennia. For one group, a specific hill or valley is their divinely promised homeland, a story passed down through generations. For another, that same land is the heart of their ancestral kingdom, a fact celebrated in their own epic poetry. When these two deeply held, myth-based truths collide, the result is not a simple disagreement. It is an intractable struggle over identity itself. The modern political landscape of regions like the Middle East, the Balkans, and South Asia cannot be fully understood through maps and treaties alone. You must also listen to the ancient stories that each side holds as sacred history. These narratives, often born from the same kind of political propaganda we have explored, provide the emotional fuel for modern nationalism. They answer the profound question of who we are by defining who we are not, casting neighboring peoples as eternal adversaries in a drama that began long before anyone now living was born. Recognizing this does not excuse conflict, but it does foster a more nuanced and empathetic understanding. It allows us to see that people are not just fighting for dirt and water, but for the soul of their story, for a legacy that gives their struggle meaning. This demonstrates with sobering clarity that the past is never truly dead. It is not even past. It lives on in the grievances we nurse and the heroes we celebrate, a quiet echo from a forgotten king's boast that can still dictate the fate of nations today. Given how deeply these stories are embedded in our very sense of self, it is unrealistic to believe we will ever fully escape their pull. They are the bedrock of our national anthems, the heroes in our children's story books, and the names of our city streets. To erase them completely would feel like a form of cultural amnesia, a loss of the stories that have given generations a sense of belonging and purpose. The true goal, then, is not a purge, but a profound shift in our relationship with these tales. We must learn to appreciate them not as factual records, but as powerful cultural artifacts, as literary masterpieces that tell us something vital about the people who crafted them. A founding epic reveals the specific anxieties of a young kingdom desperate for legitimacy. A legend about a golden age exposes the longings of a society living through political turmoil. These stories are a window into the human heart of history, showing us what our ancestors feared, what they desired, and how those in power sought to shape that desire for their own ends. This awareness gives us a new kind of freedom. It allows us to hold our history more lightly, to admire the beauty of the Arthurian legend while understanding it as a Norman political project, to feel the patriotic surge of a national holiday while also remembering the complicated, often violent realities it may gloss over. We can cherish the story without being captive to its fiction. This is the ultimate purpose of our journey, to equip ourselves with a critical lens, to build a future where our identity is informed not by romanticized fables, but by a more honest, evidence-based understanding of our shared and wonderfully messy human past. Our journey through these layers of time uncovers a fundamental human truth that we are wired for narrative. The stories we inherit about who we are and where we came from are far more than simple records. They are living, breathing forces that actively mold our identities, dictate our politics, and shape the very future we strive to build. By learning to spot the seams in history's grand tapestry, to see where the thread of fact has been woven with the thread of political need, we reclaim our own power. We become more critical, more thoughtful, and far less susceptible to the stories designed to guide our beliefs without our consent. Ultimately, the most powerful and enduring myths are rarely the ones that are factually accurate. They are the ones that speak to our deepest needs, the stories we so desperately want to believe about ourselves. I invite you now to look at the foundational stories of your own culture, the tales you learned in school or celebrate on national holidays with this new and questioning perspective? Which historical fact have you started to see in a different light? Share your thoughts in the comments below and subscribe for more journeys into the shadows of